Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, hosted by Traces.Dreams on Future Framed TV. I'm here with Ash Morse, and we're going to be asking the question, what is normal? Ash, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me a part of this very important conversation.
Ash, before we jump in with the first question, what perspectives and experiences do you bring to the question, what is normal?
In my day-to-day life, I am faced with this question a lot, and I find myself really trying to unpack it for myself and for people, because for me, the notions of normality carry what might be termed as a kind of linguistic violence that we impose and inflict on ourselves and each other, where we have what we believe is a normal state. And all these people walking around have their ideas about normal, but where they don't intersect, where they kind of rub up against each other in the unspoken areas, creates real suffering for people. And for me, it's a real opportunity to, rather than just putting your hands up and saying, well, what is normal, and leaving it at that, to really dive deep. And if you're lucky enough to be able to answer that question for yourself, what is normal? I think a just as important question to be asking is, why is that normal? So when you actually nail it down and go, okay, this is normal for me, I think, just as important is to go, but why? Because it's seldom that people actually go that deep into it. And it's such an important thing to be considering, because it's a really pervasive concept.
Linguistic violence. This is an interesting concept. How is the word normal inflicting linguistic violence? And I'm asking this question before I even ask you what normal is, but linguistic violence, tell us what that means.
It's basically the way that we form ideas and words to understand our worlds. Let me think of an example. So ADD didn't always exist. It was kind of generated at a certain point. It was quite common to know someone, or to have someone in your class with ADD, or even to experience ADD oneself. For those who don't know what that is, attention deficit disorder. And the two words deficit and disorder are really interesting because, well, disorder suggests that there is some kind of order, that there's a state of normality from which someone or a behavior is deviating. Deficit also suggests that there's a standard, that if you haven't met it, then you're without. Now, those two words are very, very powerful, and if they're applied to a person or a personality, can have really detrimental effects to their self-esteem, to their self-belief, their ability to achieve, the way that they see themselves and how they interact with their peers, because they're the one with a disorder and a deficit when other people aren't, and they're in the same classes with these people. So I don't know if that kind of paints a picture of what I'm talking about, but linguistic ideas, the words and the ideas that come with them, actually hurt. Like, they can do damage to people's concepts of self.
So that can be a form of self-harm as much as it can be a form of social harm upon other people.
Yeah.
I really like this idea, and certainly when you talk about words like deficit, it suggests that there's something lacking, or disorder, like you said, it means that there is an order that has been disrupted. So there's a violence in these words that indicate lack or disruption. How is there a violence in the word normal?
Well, normal is setting the standard, isn't it? It's going, this is what we expect, and any deviation from that is abnormal, problematic, deviant. And so, yeah.
I really liked the gesture you did there. You moved one hand up and one hand down, and it wasn't that we have to meet and surpass this expectation. It means that we need to be on that standard. And if we're performing above it, or if we're performing below it, if we're a standard deviation away from it, then we are deviants. I like how the hand gesture actually told me a lot about how you're talking about normality. So let me jump in with the question, what is normal?
Normal is an agreement, I think. And when I go deeply enough into this concept, people are like, oh, well, what does that mean? Then there is no normal and we should just accept everything as it is. No, I don't think that society could work that way. I think that we need to have agreements, but I think the problem with concepts of normal is that they're an imposition. So someone at a certain level of power is imposing ideas upon us or others, and is maybe unknowingly, I don't know, creating suffering and limitation on people.
So normality is an agreement. I really like that, because in suggesting that it's an agreement, you're also suggesting that
A
we could,
conversation.
yeah, that we can actually, once we realize that we've agreed with something that has been imposed upon us, we can perhaps liberate ourselves from that agreement.
Yeah.
When you said that you unpack this for yourself and with other people, how does that roll out for you in everyday life?
Can I start with the journey
Absolutely.
to answer that question? So I was born into one version of normal. And I don't know if you knew this about me, but I was born into the world of Mormonism. And that world is very well structured and known and normal. My idea of a family unit and spirituality and how to negotiate the trials of life were set for me as this is the standard of normality. And in some ways, I kind of lament the loss of it because it felt very safe. But I got to an age where certain parts of the belief systems that were being imposed upon me didn't feel right. And so I started to investigate elsewhere and very quickly realized that there were lots of different versions of normal outside of that world. And that from the outside, it actually looks very abnormal. And so that kind of springboarded me into this journey of discovery into all these different versions of normal and how they kind of crash into each other and affect each other. And it led me to kind of go into the psychotherapy side of things, because where I found a lot of people were limiting themselves and each other was with this concept of this is what I believe to be normal, and anything that isn't this is problematic, or this is what everyone else expects is normal and I'm not that, and so I'm problematic. And so there's all this suffering in the world, so all this individual and collective suffering going on needlessly, because people aren't diving deeply enough into this question: what is normal, and why is it normal, and is it actually the best way to be viewing ourselves and each other?
So has this translated into, this sounds like a very personal journey, but has this translated into your professional life as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's basically the foundation of everything that I do.
And what do you do?
So for this is my 11th year now. I've been working as a psychotherapist. I use primarily hypnotherapy, but through the process of talk therapy, help people to unpack their notions of normality, to really assess them and to critique them to the point where they can consciously choose what is going to work for them and what isn't. Because as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this conversation, it's largely unconscious, this process of standardizing everything and trying to create standards and barriers between my version of normal and your version of normal. We don't really know that they're there until somebody else bumps into it and you go, that's not right. So it's that's why I was really excited when you contacted me and this was the topic. So I was like, great, this is another opportunity to have this conversation and to dive even deeper into it.
Yeah, and hopefully popularize the idea that normality is something we can unpack, we can deconstruct, we can dismantle, and decide what to do with from there, right? When you're working with a client as a psychotherapist and the topic of normality comes into the equation, either because someone has had an uncomfortable experience that perhaps jarred with their sense of normality, or perhaps because you're trying to sort of lift this to their attention, where do you go to from there?
It always comes down to what is the most helpful. Because where I'm hoping to get people is to a state of peace and acceptance. And the further their life circumstances or the further their emotions are from what they consider to be normal, the greater the suffering. So it's about shifting the perception around that gap to bring them together so that what's normal for them is what's going on. And then there is no more suffering.
What I love about you, Ash, is that, I mean, I know you as a stage musician. So, you know, when you're unpacking that normality in your professional life as a psychotherapist, this is all very new for me. What about as a musician, if we can explore that for a moment? Do you get to play with normality in a very different way?
I feel like the choice, the conscious decision to become a musician was my first major step towards an abnormal life. While all of my friends were getting their degrees and following the straight and narrow, getting their job in their dream company and working their way up the ladder and saving and buying their houses and getting married and having kids, I was there working odds and end kind of jobs and playing gigs late at night, staying up late at night, rehearsing late at night, spending every spare cent that I had upgrading gear or going into studios and paying for recording time. It left me at a very different place to most of my friends. So yeah, it's been what a lot of people would probably consider to be quite an abnormal journey.
Does that help? Having a journey which is not necessarily considered normal, does that help give you a vocabulary for talking about different standards and different versions of reality?
And a great deal of empathy, because I know what it's like to have walked my own version. And so when someone comes to me with a problem with their reality, I'm able to go, okay, well, that's just as legitimate in its own way as mine, rather than just shutting it down and going, well, this is normal. Then it helps me to step back from it and accept it with open ears, having done it myself.
Right. I like that. I was sitting here thinking, okay, he's got a vocabulary to talk about this, and then you introduced the idea that, well, it didn't just give me a vocabulary; it gave me emotional intelligence to connect with people whose experiences a lot in life are different from my own, and I know what it's like to have a different journey, and I also know what it's like to look for the tools that are useful for the journey I want to have. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also gave me a value for alternative perspectives, because there's so much to learn from traveling the untrodden path. And if someone else has done it for me, all the better, because then I can kind of gather their bits of wisdom vicariously.
And what have you along the way?
What have I learned? Oh, suffering is optional once you realize that it is. And that's probably one of the most important things that I've picked up, that there are lots and lots of things to suffer over, and that they all ultimately are attached to ideas of self, of what is supposed to be. And the moment that you let go of that notion, the faster you can be free.
There's a whole new skill set people need to learn, I guess, once they're in that new space.
Yeah, it gets really deep really fast.
And what kind of skills are useful once you liberate yourself from these standards, these limiting mindsets?
I think it's a case of, once you get to a place yourself, there's almost a compulsion to want to share, because life's short and it can be really fun. And there's so much to be gained and to be shared in terms of joy, when we're not limiting ourselves and each other with ideas of how we're supposed to be.
And when we recognised earlier in the discussion that normal can be a self-limiting idea, but it can also be a violent form of social violence upon others. When people go through this process of critiquing their own ideas of normality, first of all, I guess exposing them, becoming cognizant and realizing that they've got these set standards in their minds, and then looking at whether or not these beliefs are self-limiting or self-harming, is there another step after that to learning how to be more empathic to others, to learning to not cast these similarly violent ideas on other people?
I think the step of going through the process of realizing that your own ideas can be questioned and can be reframed is in itself an empathy harboring, an empathy cultivating experience, because you all of a sudden stop judging yourself, and then you stop needing to judge others so harshly.
So ideas can be questioned. So let me ask you, what questions do you think we need to ask about normality?
Well, I would like to reiterate that first one, If you're lucky enough to be able to drill down and have some awareness around what you think is normal for yourself, the next most important question is to ask, why is it normal? Like flowers, for example, why do we mutilate the genitals of plants and give them to each other in sympathy? It's a really strange thing, and so many people do it, and we just kind of perpetuate these behaviors generation to generation without stopping them in their tracks and going, yeah, that's kind of weird. Do we need what? Like, why do we need to do this? Why do we keep doing this to each other and to ourselves? Yeah, the question why? Why is it normal? And then I guess the next question is it helpful? Is it helpful to hold on to these notions of normality so strictly as though they are truth, as absolute as truth can be? If it's not helpful, who would we be without them? And if we would still be our genuine ultimate selves, then what could the world be like for us and for each other if we just let them go?
I love those questions. Such good ones to hold on to. Why is it normal? And is it helpful?
Yeah.
For me, those questions open up new spaces of creativity and new spaces to engage more thoughtfully with people around you. Ash, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's such an important conversation to continue.
Cheers.